Take out your Bibles, if you will, turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 11. 1 Corinthians chapter 11. Moving into a new section in this book, Paul is going to be addressing some problems with respect to their public worship, starting here in chapter 11, also 12, 13, 14. All of those chapters deal with issues relative to their public worship. And it's one of the few glimpses we get, by the way, into the worship services of the early church. We have very few passages that actually deal with this. And of course, this passage to start with, verses 2 through 16, are dealing with a very controversial issue among our brethren, and that is the woman's head covering. And I've studied this for many, many years. I'm sure you have as well. And I've learned that every viewpoint that brethren put forward has problems with it. And so the bottom line here, we need to kind of figure out what we believe. You personally, I don't mean all of us together, I mean you personally. Each one of us needs to figure out what we believe about it and kind of leave it at that. If you try to push this, you're going to cause problems in a local church. It has happened before. When you push one view or the other to the exclusion of everybody else's viewpoint, you can cause problems here. It's very difficult to nail this one down. It's tough. I have my view, and I'm going to teach what I believe, but I'm also going to bring in some of the other viewpoints as well. And by way of some preliminary remarks, I want us to note very carefully, first of all, that there are actually two coverings in this text. One is artificial, that's put onable and take offable, and the other one is natural. For example, in verse 5, every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered. Now notice the phrase prays or prophesies. She has to be covered when she's doing a certain thing, okay? So that tells you that she doesn't have it all the time. If she had it all the time, you wouldn't need the phrase praise or prophesies. That would be irrelevant. You would have it all the time. And so it's one that's put onable and take offable. And then there's one that should be there all the time, the hair. Verse 6, if a woman is not covered, let her also, notice the word also, so this is something else, let her also be shorn. What does he mean by be shorn? Shave. Yeah, or cut her hair. There's shorn and shaved, both mentioned in verse 6. So shorn is having her hair cut, shaved is having it shaved off, bald. So you have shorn and shaved, and that's talking about the natural covering, the hair. So you have an artificial covering, and you have a natural covering, and that's important to understand that. Now, one covering is based on custom. The other covering is based on creation. Notice carefully here in verses 13 through 15, judge among yourselves, is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not nature itself, the word nature here is critical. It's not talking about something that you're born with. I grew up in the 70s, the 60s and the 70s, and I can assure you I felt no shame at all. I had long hair, and I felt no shame at all about it. So when he says nature there, he's not talking about something you're born with. He's not talking about inborn knowledge. You just ought to know by nature that long hair is a shame to a man. Well, he's not talking about what you're born with. What's another definition for nature? Custom or habit, that's right. It is my nature, for example, to drink a cup of coffee every morning. That's just my nature. That's my habit. That's my practice. I wasn't born doing that, but it became my nature over the years. It became something that I did. And so he's talking here about custom. Hair lengths have always varied throughout time. Like I mentioned, the 60s and 70s, men were starting to wear longer hair in that day. Prior to that, men wore shorter hair, but you go back far enough and you go back into the whole Hebrew scriptures, and old Jewish men wore their hair long. It's very likely that Jesus had long hair, and Jewish men all wore beards. And so these things change from time to time. So that the hair is the natural covering, and it was based in more of custom, what was going on at the time. And then the other one, the other head covering up here in verses 7 through 10, the put-onable one, the take-offable one, is rooted in creation. Look at this. A man indeed ought not. And when you say ought not, what are you saying?
Don't do it.
Yeah. This is a moral imperative. A man ought not cover his head, since he's the image and glory of God. Why? Because it's a custom? Is that what he said? That's not what he said, is it? He said because he's the image and glory of God. Is man still the image of glory of God? Yep. So a man ought not cover his head. Verse 8, a man is not from woman, but woman is from man. Where did that come from? Where did we learn that? Genesis, from the Scriptures. Verse 9, for neither was man created for the woman, but the woman for the man. We learn that in Scripture. For this reason. What reason? What I just said. Because the man is the image and glory of God, because the woman was from the man, because the woman was created for the man. For this reason, the woman ought, and there's that word again. It's a moral imperative. You ought to do this, you ought not do that. Ought to have a symbol. That covering is rooted in the order of creation. So there's two coverings there. One natural, the hair. One artificial, that's put onable and take offable, like a hat or a headdress. And that one is rooted in creation. And in fact, the argument made there in verses 7 through 10 is the same argument against women preachers. Hold your spot here real quick. Turn over to 1 Timothy 2. All I'm doing right now is just kind of laying the groundwork here. I'm just giving you some background. But in 1 Timothy 2, verse 12, I do not permit a woman to teach or have authority over men, but to be in silence. For Adam was formed first, and then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman being deceived fell into transgression. Where do we learn that? Genesis. Same place. It's the same argument he's made in 1 Corinthians 11. It's the same argument. So this is not about custom. This is about divine law that's been in place since creation. So that's very important. The failure to note the two different coverings has led to a lot of the confusion, I think. One viewpoint sees the covering simply as a custom and therefore not universally binding because it's just a matter of custom. The other view sees it as tied to creation and therefore it is universally binding. So you've got brethren who say it's just a custom and brethren who say it's universally binding, and you've got confusion because sometimes they don't distinguish between the two coverings. You see. So that's very important. Again, just giving you some background here. Notice something else back in 1 Corinthians 11, that whatever the men were doing, the women were doing. That's very important. Verses 4 and 5. Every man praying or prophesying, having his head covered, dishonors his head. But every woman who prays or prophesied with her head uncovered dishonors her head. Notice that the man is doing the same thing as the woman. And the woman is doing the same thing as the man. They're both doing exactly the same thing. What is prophesying? Can you prophesy and keep your mouth shut? No. Can't do it, can you? They're both speaking. The man is speaking and the woman is speaking. The only difference is what? The woman has her head covered. Yeah. But they're both doing exactly the same thing. The man is speaking, he's prophesying. The woman is speaking, she's prophesying. But the man does it with an uncovered head, the woman does it with a covered head. So that's interesting, isn't it? In view of some of the scriptures we've already looked at. Now I would argue too that if she can speak in prophecy, she could speak in prayer. If not, why not? So these women were speaking. They were not sitting there being quiet, they were speaking. Also, one more thing in way of preliminary stuff here. I think the context requires that the men and women be together. Sometimes we want to take this completely away from the assembled church, and I think it's irrelevant. The idea is that men and women are together. And let me see if I can illustrate it with the Bible classes. I noticed that as Bible classes started, there were women going back there to teach. Well, didn't we just read that I don't allow a woman to teach? How can she teach back there?
She's not usurping authority over a man.
Yeah, there's no man in that room. Yeah, exactly right. And in the same token with the covering, the reason she needs it is because there's a man present in the room. If she was off by herself, she wouldn't need it. She wouldn't, because there's no man around. There's no man to usurp authority over. So I think the context requires that the men and women be together. For example, a church assembly where we're all gathered in the same room. And so these preliminary facts lead me to conclude that these instructions were very special instructions for a very special time. Okay, that's my conclusion. God gave the miraculous gift of prophecy. We don't have anybody prophesying today. We don't have anybody doing that today. And so there's no need for a woman to cover her head because there's no woman who prophesies today. That's where I'm heading to in all of this. But, and I'm going to show you some charts here in a second, whatever view you take, even that view that I just described to you, every view has a problem. And we're going to kind of wade through some of those this morning. Let's talk about, first of all, the alternative views. There are 4 views taken by our brethren on the head covering. The first one is that all women in all church meetings are to cover their heads today. And of course, we know of brethren who believe that. And I'll say at the beginning, if you believe you need to cover your head, by all means cover your head. You should do that because you have to be right with God. It doesn't make any difference what we think about you. If you feel God requires you to cover your head, you need to cover your head. Or otherwise you're violating your conviction, and that, remember we studied about that. You can't violate your personal convictions. If that's what you believe, then that's the way you need to behave. That's the way you need to act. But this view rests on 4 verses. 1 Corinthians 11 and verse 3. I want you to know that the head of every man is Christ. The head of the woman is the man. The head of Christ is God. That's always true, isn't it? That never changes. And then verse 7 through 10, we read earlier, a man ought not cover his head since he's the image and glory of God. Notice that. Not because it's a custom, but because he's the image and glory of God. This is rooted in creation. This goes all the way back to the beginning. And so he says, the woman is the glory of man. Verse 8, the man is not from the woman, but the woman from the man. That's always been true. Nor was the man created for the woman, but the woman for the man. For this reason, the woman ought to have a symbol of authority. So because of the way he argues that, rooting it in creation, using the same argument that Paul uses in 1 Timothy 2 against women preachers. He doesn't base that on custom. He bases it on the order of creation. And so the people who hold that view would say, therefore, the covering is always binding on all women in all church meetings. And we'll come back and show you how that has some problems with it in a minute. I'm just putting the 4 views before you right now. The second view, probably the most popular view among our brethren, is that Paul wrote of a custom that was peculiar to Corinth. And usually they'll appeal to a couple of verses here. Verse 2, I praise you, brethren, that you remember me in all things and keep the traditions. And a tradition and custom is the same thing. If you look them up, the words are synonymous. And then verse 16, if anyone seems to be contentious, we have no such custom, nor do the churches of God. So some brethren latch onto those 2 words at the beginning and at the end. They'll say this was just a custom at Corinth. It wasn't universally binding. That's probably the most common view among our brethren. I think it's also the weakest view, in my personal opinion. It's weaker than dishwater. It doesn't hold up at all under scrutiny. But we'll talk. But imagine that, Paul spending 15 verses saying that a woman ought to cover her head, and then in verse 16 say, never mind. It's just a custom. That just doesn't track in my mind. That doesn't make any sense. Why would he spend 16 verses arguing for the covering and then turn around and say, never mind, it's just a custom? That just doesn't make any sense. The third view is that the only covering mentioned is the hair. And so just as long as a woman has long hair, she's sufficiently covered. And that's based on verses 13 to 15. And the argument goes something like this. Let's read those verses. Judge among yourselves, is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not even nature itself teach you that if a man has long hair, it's a dishonor to him, but if a woman has long hair, it's a glory to her, for her hair is given to her for a covering? They'll say, see there, he just told you what the covering is. It's her hair. Her hair he just told you what it is, and so that's it. And so they'll say that's the only covering in the text, and therefore, as long as a woman has long hair, she's fine. Okay. That has some things to commend it. It also has some issues, which we'll discuss in a moment. Each one has issues, even the one I'm about to put up here, which is the viewpoint I take. That the covering, this is my position, that the covering was only for the inspired women who prayed and prophesied. But even that view has issues. But it does have the benefit of taking Paul at his word. Look at what he said in verses 4 and 5. Every man having his head covered dishonors his head. Is that what that says? Praying or prophesying. Catch that. Not every man, period, but every man praying or prophesying. So this view has the benefit of at least taking Paul at his word. So that's the viewpoint I take, but there are issues with that one too. I want, no matter which position you take, it's like, there's problems, there's issues. But those are basically the four positions that are put forth by our brethren on this passage. Let's take them one at a time. Let's talk about, is it binding in the assembly today? Apparently, looking around, no one here believes that because nobody's wearing one. So no one here believes that, but there are people who believe that. And so let's just kind of wade through that. And remember, we were just reading verses 4 and 5. When was the woman to cover her head?
Pray and
Pray to prophesy. You don't have to be in a church assembly to pray or prophesy. Philip had 4 virgin daughters which did prophesy. Remember that? They went into Philip's home. They weren't in the church assembly. They went into Philip's home, and he had 4 virgin daughters which did pray. You could prophesy outside the context of a church assembly. So that's a little bit of an issue with the binding in the assembly. You would have to have it on every time you prayed or prophesied. If you sat down for a meal and you prayed, you'd have to put a head covering on. If it's binding, if it's universally binding, when you sat down to pray at the dinner table, you'd have to put a head covering on. If you go to the restaurant after services and you pray before you eat, you're going to have to put a head covering on, if this position is true, because it's not limited to the assembly. You could pray or prophesy any place. And if you're sitting at the dinner table and you pray, then you better put it on, right? So that's one problem with saying it's binding in the assembly today. Secondly, I call this the missing links. Our brethren read verse 4 and 5, and they say, every man praying or prophesying having his head covered dishonors his head, but every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. And they emphasize every man and every woman. See, every man and every woman. They emphasize that. But it doesn't say every man and every woman. It says every man praying or prophesying. It doesn't say, here's what's missing. It doesn't say every woman who sits in an assembly, every woman who eats the Lord's Supper, every woman who gives, every woman who sings, every woman who listens to a sermon or is led in prayer must be. That's what's missing. That's what the covering man has to prove. The person who believes in the covering as binding at all times, he's going to have to prove that. Now, they usually try to prove it by saying, well, praying or prophesying means all of that. But I'd like to see some proof. That's just an assertion. You can say that all day long, but I want to see some proof. But they would argue that praying or prophesying means all that stuff. But why would he say it that way? Why would he limit it to those activities? So this is what's missing. If you're going to prove that the covering is binding, you'd have to put all that, insert all that into the text, and it's not there. Gene.
In the first one, that the woman, as long as she's got her head covered in the assembly, she can talk.
Yeah.
But if she don't have her head covered, she's showing authority or showing
Submission.
manhood.
Yeah, she's showing submission. That's what I'm saying. Yeah, she could do it in the assembly in those days because she was inspired.
Yeah, but
there you are. There you are. I see that look, and that's what I'm saying. That view has problems too.
Yeah.
It does.
Yeah.
They all have problems.
You're saying it because you believe that they would have had the gift of prophecy.
Yeah,
So
they were gifted.
then at that time, then that would be,
It was like an
that would be
exception.
allowed for them to
Yeah.
give their prophecy, but
Yeah.
they would still to have they would have a head covering.
It was an exception to the rule,
To
basically.
show authority.
Yeah.
And show they was in submission.
Yeah, that's right. Now, here's the third problem. The women in our text were prophesying. And we said a while ago, you can't prophesy unless you're speaking. You can't prophesy and sit there like a bump on a log. You got to be speaking. These women were speaking. But today, lady, you come to church, put a covering on that head and shut your mouth. Well, now, wait a minute. That's not what was happening in 1 Corinthians 11. She put a covering on her head and prophesied. Okay? It's not put a covering on your head and shut your mouth. It's put a covering on your head and prophesy. So they don't do what the text says. So to me, that view just doesn't hold any water at all. And as I said, as I look around the room, apparently you all agree with that because nobody here is wearing one. Yes?
All of that, I mean, the prophesying and all that has been done away with.
Right.
So that wouldn't even apply to us at all
Exactly.
today.
Exactly. That's my point. Yeah. And we're building to that, but you're seeing where I'm going here. Since there's nobody prophesying today, there's no need for the head covering today. All right, let's take the second view. What about a local custom? I told you before, I thought this was the weakest view, and I really sincerely believe that. First of all, think about the city of Corinth. When Paul went in there, one of the issues we just come off of it in chapter 10. One of the issues was meat sacrificed to what? Idols. This was a pagan city, and it was an immoral city. Paul talked about adulterers and fornicators and homosexuals, and such were some of you. So it's an immoral pagan city. And do we really think that Corinth had a custom that recognized the headship of Christ? You know, this whole thing is rooted in verse 3. He says, the head of every man is Christ. The head of the woman is the man. The head of Christ is God. That's what the whole head covering is based on. And so do we really think that that Corinth had a custom that recognized the headship of Christ? I find that hard to believe. Yes.
I agree, but to a point, because the Islamic community has the same custom, so you don't have to be a Christian in order to cover your head.
And with them, it's actually more than a custom. They'll kill you if you don't wear one. They'll kill a woman if she don't wear one, or beat her pretty bad.
And I remember Andy making the point, the covering, like the Muslim, it's a full covering. It ain't just a little.
You put a little doily on your head. That's
Don't look
what
at it's a full covering of the head.
One preacher said you put a little lace doily on your head that's got holes in it big enough to pour dry lima beans through. He said that ain't covered. You ain't covered. If you was cold and the cow said, "Mama, come throw a cover on me," she throw a little lace doily on it, you'd probably yell at her, wouldn't you? That ain't no cover. What are you talking about? That little lace doily.
It's just their custom.
Yeah, with the Mennonites. Yeah. So I find it hard to believe that a custom peculiar to Corinth being this immoral and pagan city, that they'd have a custom that recognized Christ as head over man. They don't even believe in Christ. So that doesn't track with me at all. Here's another one. Has it ever occurred to anybody that binding human customs is sinful? Paul clearly said a woman ought to have a covering on her head. He said that clearly in verse 10. A woman ought to have a covering on her head. And so, has it ever occurred to anybody that binding a human custom is sinful? It is, isn't it? Look at these verses. Colossians 2 and verse 8. Beware lest anyone cheat you through philosophy and empty deceit, according to the tradition of men. Well, what another word for tradition? Custom. According to the tradition of men, according to the basic principle of the world, and not according to Christ. And then he goes on down here in verse 20. If you died with Christ from the basic principles of the world, why, as though living in the world, do you subject yourselves to regulations? Do not touch, do not taste, do not handle, which all concern things which perish with the using, according to the commandments and doctrines of men. So there are God-given traditions and there are man-given traditions. And binding human traditions is not allowed. You're not allowed to do that. Jesus said in Matthew 15, in vain they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. Yeah. So binding human customs and human traditions is sinful in the first place. So how could you take a human custom out of a city of Corinth and say everybody's got to do that? That doesn't track. Think about this. Verse 16. This is what they always appeal to on the custom. If any man wants to be contentious, we have no custom, nor do the churches of God. And I say, see, it's a custom. Who really believes that Paul argued in verses 7 through 10, a woman ought to cover her head. A man ought not to cover his head because he's the image and glory of God, because the woman was made from the man and for the man, and then turn around in verse 16 and say, never mind. Never mind. I argued long and hard for it, but never mind. It was just a custom anyway. That, to me, that just it's like, what? Why would Paul do that? Why would he spend 16 verses arguing in favor of the custom based on the order of creation, or arguing in favor of the covering based on the order of creation, and then just say, never mind in verse 16? That just doesn't track in my mind. Maybe it tracks in yours, but it doesn't track in my mind. So there's that view. How about this one? The hair is the only covering. That's the view that some people take. What makes nonsense of verse 6? Look at verse 6. For if a woman is not covered, now if the hair is the covering, and the woman is not covered, what's happened to her hair? It's been cut. So if a woman is not covered, her hair's been cut off, then let her also cut her hair off. Well, how do you do what's already been done? That tells you that the covering was put on and take off of. It's not just her hair. If it was just her hair, verse 6 doesn't make any sense. If a woman is not covered, that is, she's cut her hair, then let her also cut her hair. That just doesn't make any sense at all. So it makes that verse complete nonsense. Here's another one. Why mention the praying or prophesying? Every man praying or prophesying. Every woman who prays or prophesying. If the covering was the hair, that would be irrelevant. She would have it all the time, right? What does she do? Cut it, prophesy, and then grow it back again? Just to be rebellious? That doesn't make any sense, does it? The mentioning of the praying or prophesying would be irrelevant. Because if it was the hair, she would have the long hair all the time. Whether she's praying or prophesying wouldn't matter.
Verse 6 definitely makes it two different things, because at the bottom of it said, after it said let her head cut off her hair and let her head be shaved, let her cover her head.
Yeah.
So it makes the covering is separate.
Yeah, it's a separate
It's something
thing.
they put on, there.
Exactly.
But to the first paragraph, there's a big difference between the hair cut off and being shorn.
Yeah.
You can have short hair, that doesn't mean your head is shorn. So,
Right.
I mean, I agree with what your
Well,
stance on it.
And you're onto a good point, because that's one of the things that makes this view a little bit compelling to some people. Because Paul, if you dig into this viewpoint a little bit, according to them, they say Paul gave 4 lengths of hair: long hair, short hair, shorn hair, and shaven head. So that he would say he had 4 lengths of hair, and that's kind of along the lines of what you're saying. And so there is a distinction to be made there. But again, I would go back to why would he mention the praying or prophesying? Because he would have that hair all the time, whether it was prophesying or not. If it was long hair, you'd have it all the time. And then, if that's true, then we're going to have to let long-haired women pray or teach today. If not, why not? Because he clearly says they're speaking in verse 5. Every woman who prays, she's clearly prophesying. So by analogy, today, we would have to allow a woman to do that today if she's got long hair. So think about that. Now, here's the other view. I keep looking at the clock. I don't want to run out of time here. Oh, before I get into the other view, this is what convinces me. I told you that I believed it was for inspired women. I want us to compare 2 passages, 1 Corinthians 11 and 1 Timothy 2. I got 2 Bibles up here, so let me put mine on 2 different. 1 Corinthians 11 and 1 Timothy 2. We're familiar with 1 Timothy 2 about women preachers. So in 1 Corinthians 11, notice that the man and the woman is doing the same thing. Verse 4, the man is praying or prophesying. Verse 5, the woman is praying or prophesying. They're doing the same thing, okay? Both men and women. Over in 1 Timothy 2, it's only the man. Notice 1 Timothy 2, verse 8. He says, therefore I desire that the men pray everywhere, lifting up holy hands. The word for men there in the Greek is andros, males specifically. Who leads the prayers? It is the men. So that's what he's talking about here. Who leads the prayer? It is the men. And then you don't need to know Greek to know that, because look at the next verse. Like manner that the women. So he talks about the men in verse 8 and then the women in verse 9. So he's drawing a contrast between men and women. So in one passage, men and women are doing the same thing, praying or prophesying. In the other passage, only the men pray or teach. Stay with me now. Comparing the two passages, in 1 Corinthians 11, the woman has to be covered. Every woman praying or prophesying having her head uncovered dishonors her head. Okay. But in 1 Timothy 2, look at verses 9 and 10. In like manner also that the women adorn themselves in modest apparel with propriety and moderation, not with braided hair or gold or pearls or costly clothing, but which is proper for women professing godliness with a head covering. And no head covering there, is there? There's no head covering there. So there's no mention of the head covering over there. You'd think that'd be a good place to mention it, wouldn't you? Especially when it talks about how a woman is to dress. You'd think that'd be a good place to mention the head covering. Next, in both passages, the instruction is based on the order of creation, that the man was from the woman, and in fact, we just read that, verse 7 through 10. A man ought not cover his head, since he's the image and glory of God, but the woman is the glory of the man. The man is not from the woman, but the woman is from the man, nor was man created for the woman, but the woman for the man. For this reason, what I just read there, the woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. That's based on the order of creation. Man was made first, woman was made second, woman was made for the man. So based on, and in 1 Timothy 2, the same argument is made. Verse 13, Adam was formed first, and then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman being deceived fell in the trap. So they use the same argument. So look at the two passages. And what's the difference between the two? Can you see it? Can you see why would this be true on this side and that be true on that side?
Inspiration.
Yeah, there you go. That's the only difference that I can see. On this side, the women were inspired. On that side, they're not. Notice, teaching is not prophesying. Prophesying and teaching are, what's the difference between prophesying and teaching?
Well, somebody to prophesy had to have direct knowledge from God, but anybody can teach now that has the instructions from God, even taught by someone else or taught straight from the Bible.
Yeah, prophesy, the prophet's inspired. If you prophesy, you're inspired, see. And so when you look at the two passages, the only difference that I can see is that this side, they were inspired, on that side they were not. And that accounts for the difference. God empowered these women to do something that we're not normally allowed to do. Normally, they were to remain silent. They were to let the men teach. But in this case, God had empowered them with a spiritual gift. Remember, Joel said, your sons and your daughters shall prophesy. Your old men shall dream dreams. Your young men shall see visions. On my men servants and on my maid servants I will pour out my spirit, and they shall prophesy. So women this was an exception to the rule. Well, if she's up there prophesying just like a man, how would she show submission? Put a head covering on. That's how she showed her submission. See? But we don't have any women prophesying today, and so we don't need a head covering. There's no reason to have it, to show the submission, because she's not doing that. The rule that applies today is over there. This was the rule then when they had spiritual gifts. This is the rule now without the spiritual gifts. That's my point. Now, problem with that view is, can I prove with 100% certainty that praying is inspired? No, can't. I can't prove that with any certainty. But I think the context lends itself to that interpretation. But I say that just for honesty's sake here. Every position you take has problems.
Unless, then if a woman did wear a veil, you would think she was sinning because she was making out like she was something that you know she's not.
Well, I wouldn't think she was sinning. I just think she misunderstood the passage. That's what I would think. But yeah, if she got up and tried to prophesy, I think she was sinning. If she put a covering on and got up and tried to prophesy, I think she was
Well, that's
sinning.
what you believe, that the reason they've done it is because of the veil.
Yeah.
So then that would put her in, she is saying she can prophesy in that.
But sometimes they don't see it that way. They see it as binding them regardless of the prophesying. So I would grant her that. I would grant her that.
I'm putting a little more pressure than I should on you, I'm sorry.
No, that's fine, no, I don't mind, that's fine.
I just think if I believed that, I'd have to say she was insane.
When, one of Brian's buddies, his granddaddy would question people pretty hard on it.
Yeah.
He said that, you know, because all these other women, you know, because most congregations that ever have it, will have a few, and then I've never seen one that's the majority. They may be in somewhere, but there'd be several that didn't work.
Right.
And he made the point, talking to one, said, does that make them more holy? Does that set them apart? You know, he said, he was talking to this guy, said, your wife then
Yeah.
separate and different? And he said, and that does create questions, you know.
And I heard a guy talk about this one time, and I thought it was an interesting point. Some people go for the symbolism over the substance, okay? And he says, for instance, a woman will come in there, she'll put a hat on her head, a head covering on her head, and sit there and not say a word, not even in a Bible class. And then as soon as church is over, she's bossing her husband, trying to run the church from behind the scenes. Well, what good is that? There's no subjection in that. There's no submission in that. You just put that on and think you're submissive, but you're not submissive, see? Yes.
From Corinthians to Timothy, Paul writing to Timothy, how much time had passed, or was it just no uninspired women that he was talking to at that time?
I don't think it was a matter, I don't think the time issue is critical, but there was some time between, this was in the late 60s, middle to late 60s, and this was in the 50s, so there would have been maybe 10 years time that went by. But I don't think the time issue is critical. I just think if they were inspired, they were
That would
allowed.
still hold true with what he was telling Timothy.
Yeah, I think it would still hold true in Timothy's day, but the problem is the gifts have passed away. That's what you were saying earlier. The gifts have passed away, and so this doesn't have any application to us today.
Today, I was just wondering why he said it like that in Timothy, and said it like this in Corinthians, you
Yeah.
know, and like were there none, and when he wrote it.
But you can clearly see, and that's a good question, but you can clearly see they're different, aren't they?
Yeah.
Because over here, the women are allowed to speak, and over here they are. And over here they cover, and over there they don't. So you can clearly see the difference. And I think the explanation for the difference is just right here, inspired versus uninspired. If that's not the difference, then I'm at a loss to know what it
Well,
is. Go ahead.
You may
and
be able to get to it, but what does verse 16 mean?
We'll get to it next week.
Oh, okay.
Right now, all I'm doing is laying the groundwork.
Okay.
I'm just trying to lay the groundwork. Then we'll get into the text itself and see what we make. But again, don't swallow this just because I said it. Study for yourself. Figure out what you believe about it, because it is that difficult. I truly believe it is that difficult that everybody's got to decide for themselves what they believe about it.
So
And
that
if you believe it's a custom, I'm not going to argue with you 5 seconds about it. It's fine with me. Go ahead.
that position fits with the next few chapters.
Yeah, with the spiritual gifts, because he goes right on into that. That's right. All right. I went over about 2 minutes, so I better hush. We'll talk more next week.